Welcome to the final replacement lecture for July 25th, 2019, International Politics and Drugs. This very short set of slides is going to take a look at some evidence from a trafficking and insurgency economy in northern Mali in the Islamic Maghreb region of, I guess, the Sahel region of Africa. We're going to ask the extent to which primarily we're going to be looking at whether or not Fellbaugh-Brown's theory seems to hold in northern Mali, but we'll also have some opportunities to check out whether other behaviors of the Tuareg or Keltamashek trafficking cartels match with some of the insights we've gotten elsewhere in the class. So what you really want to be looking for in terms of this lecture and in terms of these readings are two things. One, you should maybe pause the video and read the selections that I've laid out, highlighted in these slides. Check whether or not you've highlighted or noted similar types of evidence in your own reading, presuming you've done the reading. Ask yourself whether you understand how that evidence might fit with the theories that we've covered. And so if you're one, be able to read these documents and pick out sort of instinctually the evidence that really tests the theories that we've looked at, or vignettes or glimpses into the organizational behavior of these cartels that matches backward now some of the case studies that we've done of Sendero Luminoso, of La Familia Michoacan, of the street cartels in Venkatesh, of the Mexican Mafia. If you're noticing those similarities and you're capable of using this data to test our intuitions of theories about cartel behavior, that means you're really starting to get the hang of how you're applying evidence to these sort of very broad game theoretic ideas about the challenges that drug cartels face in trying to avoid or confront the state. And then if you're applying them correctly, you're sort of making the second step even. Okay, so on into Mali. In Peru, and particularly in Fellbaugh-Brown's discussion of Peru, the insurgency comes first in the narrative, right? We have this sense in Fellbaugh-Brown's writing that Sendero Luminoso is really in the driver's seat here. They have a choice between how they will protect or abandon the drug producers, how they will relate with drug traffickers, all of these sorts of things. Notice in these readings that in Mali, the framing is reverse. Trafficking, we're told, comes before an insurgency, and the traffickers in these articles are the ones that seem to have agency with respect to how they deal with the insurgents. And there are some reasons that we might believe that the drug economy is in the driver's seat in Mali, where the insurgency was maybe in the driver's seat in Peru. But I'll save some of that discussion until the end of the slides. One thing to note is that ethnicity in northern Mali is extremely important. Within the country of Mali in particular, Malian politics are deeply influenced by a long-running feud between Songhai and Bambara peoples who live in the south of Mali and Arab and Tuareg peoples who live in the north of Mali. And this sort of breaks down in the same way that race relations in the United States breaks down, unfortunately. The people in the north, the Arabs and the Tuaregs, sometimes I'll refer to them as Keltamashek. They're sort of interchangeable, mostly interchangeable terms for the same group of people. They see themselves as being descended from Arabs and Berbers and therefore as being white. And the people who are Songhai and Bambara in the south see themselves as being sub-Saharan African. They see themselves as being black. And so there's been a lot of antagonism between these two groups, particularly during the period of time in French colonization, when the French relied upon the Arab and Tuareg populations to control territory in Mali. So the French recognized that they weren't going to be able to control Mali directly as an economy. They were going to have to create some sort of like an empire structure where the French were entitled to taxes, and they entrusted local representatives to collect those taxes and pass them on to the French. So we'll see here that this is a huge swath of territory. Mali is probably a little bit bigger than France territorially, And France, at no point during its colonial suppression of Mali, deployed many more than 100 people there. Instead, France forged this alliance with a couple of vulnerable minorities. They armed them, they provided them with logistical support and training, and that allowed these groups to dominate local politics. And this particularly allowed these particular Arab and Keltamishek tribes to dominate local Songhai and Bambara populations. The influence of these tribes never went down into southern Mali, into the Bambara heartlands, but there are a lot of farmers, Songhai and Bambara farmers, that settled in central and northern Mali, and they were essentially politically dominated by these groups. As the French withdrew as a colonizer in Africa, the synergy of interest between the French and these Keltamishek tribes disappeared, and then these populations, the Tuareg and the Arabs that had previously been allied with the French, were at the mercy of their far more numerous Bambara neighbors to the south, these people that they had previously abused. And so today there's a lot of animosity running the other direction. The Tuaregs and the Arab populations in the north, who live in this sort of sparsely populated part of the country, often complain that the central government in Bamako isn't giving them the resources and the services that they deserve as equal citizens in Mali. And they argue that the reason for this discrimination is based in this historical animosity. The government in Bamako responds that services are simply harder to provide in these vast swaths of the Sahara in northern Mali, especially when so many of the people who live in northern Mali are antagonistic toward the predominantly Bambara state coming in. And it's sort of hard to know who's telling the truth here, probably some of each. We can start the story of trafficking in the Sahel and Maghreb and Sahara belts of Africa a long, long ways back. Remember the massive distances that the Jewish traders needed to travel to ship their goods? Why they needed all these agents in far-off places? Well, they were shipping their goods over hundreds and hundreds of miles that looked like this. This created an economy of specialists who know the territory and they know how to protect a caravan that's traveling through it. The state is functionally absent not only from northern Mali, but from vast swaths of Africa, the Sahel and the Sahara Belt in the north of Africa. There's not a lot of government here. Some of the bigger cities have government, bigger settlements have government, but a lot of this territory is mostly Wild West. Smuggling has a long history in the Sahel as a result, and in particular, smuggling to avoid taxes and tariffs in Europe. In the 50s through 80s, goods manufactured in Europe were often shipped to Africa into the ports on the Gold Coast in places like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and Liberia, and then they were smuggled back into Europe, trucked across the entirety of northern Africa to get back into Europe to avoid taxes. And taxes on goods in Europe were high enough that this was actually profitable. Wages in the Sahel and Africa are low enough, taxes in Europe are high enough that this is an economical proposition. So remember we spoke some time ago about how governments could avoid a lot of the violence, they could avoid a lot of the nefarious social penetration of trafficking organizations and insurgencies into their hinterlands by simply legalizing drugs. And I pointed out at that time that this might not necessarily be true, that there are a lot of regulations that generate a demand for smuggling routes. Another thing that we might imagine happens is where you have safety regulations or environmental regulations or child labor regulations, right? If a company wants to avoid engaging in the sorts of environmental protection that we think, say, a chemicals manufacturing firm should engage in, they can lower their costs by dumping toxic chemicals out their back door into the river as opposed to disposing of them properly. And then these goods become illegal and there's a demand for these goods because they're cheaper. And so there's some sort of, there's a demand that arises for smuggling or trafficking these goods. So The ecosystem of trafficking and the story of its origins in northern Mali is entirely embedded in legal goods. First, because legal goods that were being taxed or regulated properly couldn't be protected. And second, because there is a massive, massive market for tax arbitrage, particularly in cigarettes and similar goods. So eventually we learn that cocaine is a big problem. One day we just find this Boeing stacked to the roof with cocaine parked in the Gao region of northern Mali. And a study begins, or a literature begins, that exposes how the trade in illicit narcotics across northern Mali and Niger and through southern Libya and Algeria exploded in the early 2000s, which was around the same time that a new Tuareg rebellion began. The Tuaregs rebelled in the 1950s and 60s. It was a long-running insurgency, although many members of the Arab and Keltamashek communities did not participate. Mali was a newly independent state at that time, and there was a lot of optimism and hope that Mali could come together and the populations of Mali could make it work. And so there was a peace settlement in the 1970s that went quite a distance to keeping the peace through the 70s and 80s. But then again, periodically in the early 1990s and the early 2000s, we had these rebellions, which are now a lot more popular. Many, many more Tuareg and Arab citizens in northern Mali are very cynical about the state and what it provides to them. So the fact that we have this correlation between the explosion of the drug trade and the explosion of a new Keltamashek rebellion gives rise to an interesting question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Does the rebellion allow trafficking, or does the trafficking allow rebellion? Let's unpack this question just a little bit, right? Why might trafficking facilitate a rebellion? Well, this is sort of standard Fellbop Brown stuff, right? This is the story of how the Sendero Luminoso rebellion found itself political support, found itself a revenue stream by protecting coca producers and taxing drug traffickers who are moving in and out of Peru. So the smuggling creates a revenue stream that is convenient for insurgents to protect and tax. These insurgents probably already know the smuggling routes by virtue of being a clandestine group themselves, and so it's relatively easy, for the reasons that we discussed in the Fellbop Brown lecture, for these insurgents to reach out and grab this money. Why would an insurgency facilitate trafficking? What is it about an insurgency that might make it easier for traffickers to function? Well, of course, the main threat to a trafficking business is the state. And if an insurgency begins in the territory where the drugs are being produced or through which they're being trafficked, that lawlessness provides cover and freedom for the drug traffickers, right? The state isn't breathing down your neck all the time. So in the context of Mali, we should ask, did the Tuareg elite want independence from Mali and use the drug trade to fund it? Or are drug traffickers in northern Mali cynically interested in lowering their costs, and as a result pose as nationalist fighters for a new Tuareg and Arab state in northern Mali? The ruggedness of northern Mali and southern Algeria, across all of these trading routes, coupled with the expertise that the Tuareg had developed at negotiating this territory and negotiating protection within this territory over generations, made these routes attractive to smugglers. These routes became very important very quickly once they were opened up. Even within the north, the emergence of new drug markets empowered new elites and shook up the old social order. So what's the claim here in this passage, right? The claim here is that drug money generates incentives for factional splitting and competition. You have communities which are held together by their ethnicity, potentially you might argue by their common annoyance with the state. But when drugs or new revenue streams come into town, those that are relatively empowered by those new revenue streams are now capable of holding it over their old co-ethnics. So you introduce essentially a class struggle into what was previously an ethnic struggle. And so, as some families and some tribes, or Edabel they call them, war drums is the translation of that from the Keltamishek language, as new Edabel are empowered by drug trafficking rents, they attempt to take local political control. This leads to a creeping militarization of cartels and further destabilization in northern Mali, right? So, as you have these drug cartels that start to fight over politics within an ecosystem that's already fighting for its independence against Mali, you have this real soup of chaos that starts to build up in Mali. The money affects local politics, which is neither shocking nor different, right? We already know that drug trafficking organizations elsewhere bribe politicians. But again, just another way that the standard relationships that existed in the 1990s in northern Mali are being shaken up by drug money. And this is especially true because northern Mali is extremely poor. And now, suddenly, we have a mysterious source of wealth that appears to be funding local, extremely hyper-local feuds between Keltamishek Edabel or tribal groups. We have mysterious cash infusions that seem to be funding nationalist armies. And starting in the late 2000s, some of this wealth seems to be pouring into jihadist groups like Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, like Mujahideen, like Ansar Dine. So the fact that the state is missing, which means that traffickers are on their own, both for regularized commerce and for drugs, means that traffickers and business people alike often need to seek protection from these strongmen. So you have drug traffickers that are arming themselves in a context where you have local rebel groups who are attempting to use their own weaponry to essentially replace the state, right? So this sounds to me like a much more complicated version of producers in Peru, drug producers in Peru, who turn to the Sendero Luminoso insurgency to provide themselves with protection that the state isn't providing. Here you have lots of businesses, including the business of traffickers, who are starting to entwine themselves with radical groups and nationalist groups in order to lower the cost of smuggling across relatively lawless territory. Here's a potential example of Mokhtar Belmokhtar. Here in this particular, I think this is the ICG report, argues that Mokhtar Belmokhtar began life as a local smuggler and formed a marriage of convenience with a Salafist group. Mokhtar Belmokhtar is a huge figure in northern Mali. The standard story is that he began his career as a smuggler of cigarettes and hashish into Europe, then became a prominent figure in the nationalist movement when the MNLA was attempting to declare independence from the Malian state. And then, after the MNLA was chased across the Malian border back into southern Algeria by the French, he sort of re-emerged after the collapse of the Gaddafi regime in Libya with a bunch of new weapons from the collapsed Libyan army, and had declared himself a pious Muslim who was going to take over northern Mali in the cause of jihad. So a lot of people, Mokhtar Belmokhtar keeps coming back and coming back and coming back. Now, what's really interesting about this is you may have noticed that a couple of the other articles draw some amount of doubt onto the question of whether Belmokhtar has ever been involved in smuggling at all. All of the evidence about Belmokhtar's involvement is secondary. It comes from people who claim to have been his employees, who claim to have worked for or with him. But there's no direct evidence that actually shows Belmokhtar's involvement. And so some number of Tuareg watchers who are interested in this violence argue that in fact the narrative that Belmokhtar has ever been a smuggler has only ever been spread by his rivals in order to undercut his image as a true revolutionary for an independent northern Mali and independent Azawad, as the Kel Tamasheq call the state that they agitate for. So this is pretty interesting, right? I mean, this shows you just how little Europeans and Americans in the Western world in general understand about what's happening in northern Mali. I mean, you look for pictures of this dude, and they're extremely hard to find. There are only half dozen pictures of Mukhtar Belmokhtar that are even in existence, and we're not even entirely sure whether he's a true believer in either jihad or the nationalist cause in northern Mali, or whether he's a cynical smuggler. Um, Here we see some amount of evidence that there are financial contributions being made by traffickers to these jihadist and nationalist organizations, and not just money, but ammunition, weapons, and vehicles. A lot of times, again, according to mostly secondhand stories, drug traffickers will park their caravans full of these what are known as tacticals. They're um, pickup trucks that have been jacked up and had the sides of the pickup truck removed. They mount artillery on the back of the pickup truck, and then they use the surrounding area on the flatbed of the pickup to smuggle drugs. They bury their caches of drugs in the desert and turn their tacticals around to fight where the nationalist movement or jihadist movement that they prefer happens to be fighting. And so, in this way, these military groups can rely on sudden infusions of equipment from drug traffickers when they really need them. Some participants appear to have dual roles as revolutionary generals and drug traffickers. Ayad Agbahanga is a much more well-documented trafficker. We understand that he actually is involved in trafficking in northern Mali. He's sort of an emergent figure. And he's also seen as a new emerging patron of the nationalist Tuareg cause. So we might ask ourselves if these calls for political reform, his concern about inequality in Kidal, is genuine, or are these just a cover for drug smuggling? Or maybe it's both, right? Where have we seen this sort of behavior before? Well, La Familia engaged in this behavior. Pablo Escobar engaged in this behavior. And these are groups that we probably think are engaged in social agitation purely instrumentally, purely cynically, to gain support from the locals, to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the government, and make life easier for smugglers. But we've also seen this same combination of behavior from Sendero Luminoso. The case that Sendero Luminoso are really drug traffickers in disguise is, of course, much weaker. These are people who put their new recruits through weeks of training, cyclical training, learning about Marxism, learning about Maoism, learning about tactics to keep the hearts and minds of the people on your side. So which of these actors prefer genuine political change, and how can we parse through the evidence to determine whether, in this case, Agbahanga is actually a good faith nationalist? He does use his political influence and the profits from his smuggling business to generate aid for northern Mali, but again, we've seen evidence that La Familia and Pablo Escobar and similar drug traffickers do the same thing. And there's also some direct evidence that his participation in nationalist causes is cynical. So what are the advantages of being a rebel smuggler? Why join a rebel group to help manage your trafficking? Are you seeking institutional influence and control? The desire to keep the state out of a territory that you need for your business? Does it just allow your fighters to earn more income? You're getting donations from true believers in nationalist or Islamist causes in addition to drug rents. Felbott Brown presents rebels and traffickers as siloed out groups. They're totally separate. Sendero is not part of the drug production economy directly. They don't traffic drugs directly until very, very late in their organizational life. But is that the case here? Are we seeing something truly different? Do we have people who are directing both types of activity? Or is this just another example of the sort of crime incorporated misapprehension of how organized crime works that started the class and motivated it, right? Freiman tells us over and over again, and Andreas and Nadelman tell us over and over again, that the media and popular culture provide us with an image of organized crime as being much more organized and interconnected and solid than it really is. Maybe part of the reason that we think that traffickers like Agbahanga are taking on dual roles and directing jihad at the same time that they're directing drug trafficking is just because we understand very little about what's happening in northern Mali. If we can't tell for sure whether Balmukhtar is even involved in trafficking, maybe the problem here is really a lack of evidence. This is interesting, right? We have evidence that jihadists in the late aughts and early 2010s are denouncing drugs, but these are plainly groups that have the option to do something about drug trafficking. They are involved in the same geographies, they know the smuggling routes, they are allegedly getting lots of money and tactical support from drug cartels. So why aren't these groups taking action against the drugs? Well, there are at least two potential explanations for this, right? One directly plugs back into Felbab Brown. It's possible that the jihadists are realizing that they are not getting their support from the population based on their extreme Muslim ideology, but rather because they are teaming up with drug trafficking organizations to provide protection for a lucrative industry. Now, Felbab Brown pointed out that this relationship is best and most profitable for insurgents when the economy that they're protecting is extremely labor intensive, where it includes lots and lots of people. And so for her, Peru was an interesting place to test this theory because growing coca is an extremely labor intensive industry. Trafficking cocaine is not, right? One thing that jumps out at me as being a potential explanation for why the context of Mali and the relationships between traffickers and insurgents in northern Mali is so different is that the main relationship that concerned Felbab Brown in Peru had to do with stationary, local, embedded, labor-intensive economies. These were the people in Peru that were receiving the protection from the insurgents are the same people who are going to serve as constituents, citizens of the new state that Sendero wanted to set up. Not so much in the case of the traffickers, right? Many of the traffickers are Keltamashek, they live in Mali, but they're transient. They move back and forth across the border between northern Mali and southern Algeria and Libya, across Niger, Mauritania. This whole belt of the Sahel is extremely porous. And so these people who are being served by the jihadist groups, this is not a particularly stable or labor-intensive economy. So maybe a lot of the differences here can be explained by the fact that these groups are protecting traffickers and not producers. So this is one potential explanation, right? Perhaps the jihadists are just too tempted by the taxes and support they get from drug traffickers to do anything other than offer hollow denouncements of drugs. We might also wonder whether the drug traffickers are engaged in a La Familia sort of strategy, where they are not selling drugs in northern Mali, and they posit that they're sending this vice to Europe and the United States. They're facilitating the moral and economic collapse of the Great Satan to the north. And so therefore, they're actually involved, like drugs are bad, okay? But drugs are not so bad when we send them to our enemies and have them consume them and have that weaken their economy and their society. So it's possible there's some evidence that drug traffickers in northern Mali are making this pitch. Okay, take a look at this quote and ask yourself, what's the explanation of the relationship between drugs and better weapons that's being suggested here? So the argument here is that drug cartels are militarizing in order to get drug rents. How would Felbab Brown explain this same relationship? Felbab Brown would argue that protection of the drug economy generated income that's used for a truly nationalist struggle. So again, we're seeing sort of an opposite framing of the same relationship. For Felbob Brown, the insurgents are coming in and they're engaging in drug trafficking in order to get better weapons they can use against the state or to protect the social order that they're creating. According to this International Crisis Group document, what's happening instead is that drug traffickers who are working with insurgents are spending their hard-earned cash to get money because that's what competition in the drug trafficking industry requires. Now, because we have this opposite conclusion about the same relationship, we get fantastically different policy recommendations in Mali than we do in Peru. Um, what we want to do, the authors of the IGC report argue, is give local actors access to policing. We give them local dispute resolution power. We create, essentially, local mafias that are beholden to the state, and we recognize them. So here we have a hint of Scarbeck and the Mexican mafia. Why does the U.S. tolerate the Mexican mafia? They operate in prisons with enough money, with enough determination. We could surely uproot violence in prisons, but we don't, right? We don't. And what is the cynical answer for why we don't do that? Well, it's right here in front of you in the context of Mali. Maybe if we provide some small amount of legitimacy or space to breathe for local mafias, we can actually replace militarizing drug cartels with bodies that have greater buy-in from locals. Another potential strategy we might use is to sanction or target only the most heavily armed or violent traffickers. This incentivizes disarmament, right? At the moment, the incentives are entirely in favor of arming yourselves more strongly because the rivals that you have punish you if you don't have weapons. The state attacks the weakest cartels first. The International Crisis Group argues that we've got this entirely backwards, right? There's a policy failure happening here. We need to target the strongest cartels. We need to target the cartels that have the most weapons. And then the message that we'll be sending is essentially the same as the one that we encountered in the context of American drug selling gangs. As long as you are just trafficking drugs through the country, we will let you be. We're only here about the bodies. Okay, well, that's all I have for today. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more explicitly about the problems of corruption and violence and the ways in which the state and drug cartels attempt to infiltrate and expose one another.